This is Cornstalks and Sports Talk, your go-to Iowa-based sports show, hosted by the one and only Elliot Clough.
What's up, Cedar Valley, and hello to the Hawkeye State. This is Cornstalks and Sports Talk on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com. With me, UNI insider for Town Square Media, Elliot Clough, at Elliot Clough on Twitter. We're loaded up with great recruiting content today. We've got Ethan Petrik from the Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier on to talk the 2023 football recruiting class for UNI. Of course, being a UNI insider myself, I've got some opinions of my own on that segment. Sean Bock of 24/7 Sports and HawkeyeInsider.com also gives us the details as to how the Hawks landed five-star recruit and number one offensive tackle in the nation, Kadyn Proctor, out of Southeast Polk. Of course, we talked about that last week, but Sean really gets us the nitty-gritty details, as well as telling us about a few of the other more recent commits out of the 2023 class that will be Hawkeyes. First off, though, we've got to talk about all of this conference realignment that's happening all over the country, not just in the Missouri Valley Conference. Of course, we've talked about that before. Murray State, Belmont, and UIC all joining the MVC officially July 1st, and now they'll be playing in conference in just about every sport except for the MVFC this season. But this is Power 5 realignment. So this is stuff that affects just about everyone in the country, not just the Midwest and Kentucky. No, this is all over the country, including Iowa and Iowa State, with Big Ten and Big 12 realignment. So more recently, it's been USC and UCLA, but this goes back a few years to the Big 12 and adding Cincinnati, Central Florida, and Houston, who will join the conference starting in 2023. Then in 2024, it's about to go down, to quote the great Kevin Hart. Oklahoma and Texas will join the SEC, USC and UCLA, who I just mentioned, they're joining the Big Ten. And then, of course, all this Pac-12 stuff about teams leaving the Pac-12, not only USC and UCLA, but also joining the Big 12. So schools all over the conference, of course, Oregon, Washington, I believe Colorado's in there, but they also said they were committed to being part of the Pac-12, Arizona, Arizona State. Some of these schools who haven't exactly been relevant in all of the big sports recently, Arizona for basketball, of course. But football, a lot of these teams, well, the Pac-12, I don't think they've had somebody in the Final Four or the playoff, the college football playoff, since Oregon was in it in one of those first few years, and they went on and faced, I think, Ohio State in the national championship game, if I'm remembering correctly. I think it was Cardale Jones, 12 gauge, who led them past Oregon that year, and that was the Marcus Mariota year. But anyway, to get back to the topic at hand, what I'm sitting here thinking is what the hell is going to happen to the Pac-12, whose notable teams, especially in football, are Oregon and Washington, and USC. Occasionally UCLA fits in there, and of course they've got Chip Kelly as their head coach now, which is a huge get for them. But these real major teams in the Pac-12 are just up and leaving in the next few years. I mean, when you look at the Big Ten movement from the Pac-12, of course, USC and UCLA, they will literally have to travel across the country to the other coast when they play Rutgers and Maryland. And I think the closest team to them in the Big Ten, I'm trying to think of all the teams that are there, probably Nebraska. That is insane. That is freaking crazy. And you know what's hilarious about that is that head coach for Oklahoma, of course, Oklahoma moving to the SEC in 2024, their head coach for the last however many years, Lincoln Riley, he decides to pick up and move out west to USC and essentially avoid playing in the SEC and not having a real chance of getting to the college football playoff. And now, guess what? You're going to be playing against Ohio State, Penn State, Iowa, Michigan State, Michigan. Talk about karma, man. Karma, karma. And again, geographically, this makes literally zero sense to me. Zero. And most of these conferences are aligned by region. That's how it goes. So when you're playing your conference schedule, you don't have to travel all over hell in order to play these games. Of course, when you get to the bowl season, it's a little bit different, but you're meeting in neutral locations, and you have a bunch of time to plan out those trips. These are college kids in USC and UCLA that are going to have to pick up in the beginning of the semester, maybe a few weeks into the semester, to travel all the way across the United States, literally the other side of the country, to play Rutgers on a Saturday at noon Eastern time when they live in the West Coast time zone. For these conferences and these schools who are joining these conferences, I have to ask, when that type of stuff is happening, who does this benefit? Because I'm trying to think about it. I mean, I know conferences, they distribute money to all these schools and they do it evenly, and USC has enough money. UCLA has enough money. They're playing Oregon. They're playing Washington. And of course, you know, this is all of this movement is about football and basketball. None of these other sports matter. In terms of revenue, in terms of bringing in cash flow to the university, none of them matter. Football, basketball, and donors are what matter in college football, college sports, in terms of money. That's what matters, and it's all about money. Everything's about money, right? I mean, that's the world we live in. How does this benefit the third-string linebacker who is on scholarship, who may not be on scholarship, and is going to have to miss however many classes? His sleep schedule is going to be thrown off. He might not even be able to get into the weight room. Of course, they're probably going to figure that out one way or another. How does this benefit 90% of the roster? And when you're at USC, you're going to get exposure. Caleb Williams is going to get drafted. Of course, he's the transfer from Oklahoma who is now at USC with his head coach, Lincoln Riley. How does this make any sense for these schools other than benefiting those top guys by saying, hey, this is just an awesome opportunity for all our student athletes, blah, 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 blah. NIL money, maybe, I guess, but when you're in Los Angeles and you play for the Trojans, you're going to get enough NIL money where it's at. Like, fine, national stuff, sure, but Caleb Williams, again, he's going to get that no matter what. How does this help the starting running back, who I can't even name at USC? How does this help the starting offensive lineman or backup offensive lineman who never gets a snap in his entire career at USC, just needs to pass his classes, he'll move on, get a career making $50,000 selling insurance? How does that help him? And look, I know we are on the AM 950 KOEL, and you're listening to Corn Stalks and Sports Talk. We're in Iowa. We're a red state. Capitalism, I'm just going to say this right now. Capitalism is by far the best economic system in the entire world. It's been the most profitable. It's helped the most people. This is not a critique of capitalism. I'm going to say that right now. I've told you, when we talked about gun issues, I lean right. And I'm very much a capitalist. But when I look at this and on its surface, this doesn't help the student athletes. All this does is help those guys at the top. And that's the big criticism that people like to take and apply to capitalism. And I think in this circumstance, it's fair. Like, again, NIL exposure, I mean, I guess. More money from these bigger conferences to go to facilities, sure. But you're telling me that USC and UCLA don't already have the greatest facilities, some of the greatest facilities in the entire country in college football, college basketball, and all their other sports for that matter. You're going to tell me that with a straight face. And then what happens to these schools like, I don't know, like that are in the MAC or in the Mountain West Conference, like Boise State, like Wyoming? Are they going to replace these schools in the Pac-12, or is the Pac-12 just going to dissolve and they'll join with the Big 12, and then we'll just have all these minor conferences and a Power 3? instead of Power 5? I mean, as somebody who covers an FCS school, who covers a mid-major program that's part of the Missouri Valley Conference, this favor of the Power 5 in selection to like the NCAA tournament is already pretty annoying. There have been some amazing high-level mid-major basketball programs that have just been left out of the NCAA tournament because they're mid-major. And because Cal had an 18-14 season, hey, we know you're going to bring that money to the NCAA tournament. We're going to leave North Dakota State out of it, even though they were better, even though they'd probably beat you. How is this fair to these smaller schools? Now, if the MAC, if some of these schools from the MAC or the Mountain West, like I mentioned, San Diego State or Colorado State or Boise State, they move up to the Pac-12 and then they need replacements. So then you grab a school that's like a Missouri Valley Conference school, like a Murray State, like a UNI, like a Loyola Chicago who just moved to the Atlantic 10. Maybe some of these smaller mid-major schools move up to these, quote, Power 3 or Power 5 conferences like Cincinnati did or is going to the Big 12, like Houston's going to the Big 12, like Central Florida is going to the Big 12, which, again, geographically doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think that'd be the ACC, but do what you will, I guess. And with the conferences, the way UNI, they're scheduling football, who the frick knows? They might be moving to FBS anyway. You know, you got Hawaii and Nebraska in 2024, and then Iowa and Iowa State in 2026. So if it's a rising tides lift all boats, I think that's the quote, or the phrase. I could be wrong. Then I'm for it. You know, that's great. If we're going to lift everybody up and move not everybody, but a lot of these bigger high-level mid-major schools, goodness, to these power conferences, and then we're going to move FCS programs to, you know, those sort of MAC conferences, those American conferences, Conference USAs, then I'm for it. And I think it makes a lot of sense because when you're moving up to a level like that, it's not to push anybody down. And I think that applies to just about every single thing, especially in such a high level or high revenue sport like college football is. Because there's a reason UNI is signing up to play these games. It's because it's tough to make money at the FCS level unless you're the only school that's available, like North Dakota State is in North Dakota. Of course, they got UND, but North Dakota State's freaking amazing at football. Or you look at South Dakota, they got USD, they got South Dakota State. Those programs are very well supported because they don't have those high major programs like Iowa does in the University of Iowa and Iowa State comparatively to UNI and Drake. So the money's going to be tough to come by for these mid-major, low-level, not necessarily low-level, but mid-major, smaller schools. So if it lifts them up to playing at the higher Division I level, then great, let's do it. But if this is just a power play, if this is just a move to line the pockets of the guys at the top in the Big 12, in the Pac-12, or well, not the Pac-12, I guess, the Big 10, the SEC, then what's the goal here? How does this improve things for the college athletes? I don't know. Maybe somebody else can tell me. You can message us on the KOEL app and let us know your thoughts. And of course, we're going to have to head to break right now. But we got Ethan Petrik coming on next. He's going to tell us about the UNI 2023 recruiting class for football. Very excited about that. Going to bounce some ideas off of him there as well. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to Corn Stalks and Sports Talk on AM 950, KOEL, and KOEL.com. And we're back here on Corn Stalks and Sports Talk on AM 950, KOEL, and KOEL.com with me, Elliot Clough, at Elliot Clough on Twitter. The big Power 5 schools aren't the only ones landing 2023 football commits, as UNI has earned some commitments from some of the best players in the state of Iowa, as well as out of the state too. Joining us to talk a bit about some of these new additions is Ethan Petrik from the Cedar Falls Waterloo Courier. Ethan, UNI has landed several high-profile and high-level players in the state of Iowa. And of course, some old stomping grounds for recruiting in places like Lee's Summit Any of these players that stick out to you so far and that have you excited to watch them in their coming years in Cedar Falls?
Well, before we get started on that, I just wanted to correct you real quick. My last name is Petrik, so it's the first time on, so I know what it's Petrik.
Dang it! I'm sorry.
It's all right. It's my first time on it. I expected it. That's how everyone pronounces it. But as for the recruits, I'm excited for Braylon Camrad out of Lewis Central is probably the one that I was the most excited to see. Coming off of just covering high school state track, I'd gotten a chance to see him run the 4x2 relay with the Titans down there at Lewis Central. And so I knew he had speed. And then I went and looked at his passing stats once he committed. And this is a kid that can sling the ball. 61.9% completion, 2,500 yards, 25 touchdowns. And then he added 11 on the ground. So this is a guy that's going to offer that kind of like dual threat wrinkle for UNI, kind of that new wave quarterback. So I was really excited when I saw that skill set come in. And when I was talking to him, this is a guy whose dad is his coach. So he understands playbooks at a high level. And the only reason he didn't start for Lewis Central his sophomore year in high school was because of an injury. So he had to split time with a senior that was in the building already. Then once he got back to full health, then he took over the starting job about halfway through the season his sophomore year. So this is a guy who's got a lot of experience, and he's going to come to UNI with a lot of experience. And then on top of that, his dad played for the University of Nebraska Omaha in the early 2000s as a running back. So his dad has that experience. He's going to be able to kind of mentor him on how to be a collegiate athlete, a student athlete. So I think that he's kind of the quarterback you can get excited about if you're a UNI Panther fan. So number one, that's probably my top recruit that I'm excited for. And then kind of a, I guess, hidden gem, a low-key addition that I don't think enough people are talking about, but he's going to start getting a lot of buzz, is Carson Blum from Lincoln, Nebraska. He's a tight end. He only had 2 catches last year as a junior. But that's because he was on a pretty loaded team. He was kind of buried on the depth chart, and it's a running team. But this is a kid who knows how to block. He runs 4.70. Coach Gans saw him catch at a junior day practice, and that was all he needed to see to throw in the offer. So this is a guy that Coach Gans, who was from Nebraska, played at Nebraska, knows the Lincoln area. He felt comfortable recruiting this kid before he even saw him catch. He just said, before we give the offer, we need to see you catch the ball. Blum showed him exactly what he needed, and the offer came in. They have a great relationship, Gans and Blum. So that's a low-key addition that I'm really excited about for the Panthers.
So you mentioned the Blum there, and I've seen some excitement regarding him too. And UNI has this knack for bringing in kids who can do one or two things really well and then developing them everywhere else. Like Briley Moore, who came in as strictly a wide receiver, put on a ton of weight and then learned how to block. And now he's in the NFL. And I believe he's on the practice squad for the Titans, trying to make the full squad, but 53-man squad rather. And that's what's really exciting to me about Blum and being able to see him catch. I think he's going to get more time catching the ball this fall based on what you've said here. And I'm assuming he's quite the athlete too, to only have 2 catches, to be able to block that way, and then for Coach Gans to give him that offer. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. So he actually he's a thrower in track and field as well. And that's a little bit, that goes into my background a little bit. I worked when I was at the University of Nebraska, I worked for the track team. I was the throwing manager. So I saw exactly what goes into becoming a high-level thrower, and it takes a lot of footwork, and that's going to blend with Blum as a blocker as well. He mentioned how he's seen a lot of crossover between the technique of throwing, getting that footwork right, and getting his blocking footwork right. And this is a kid who can be a bulldozer as a blocker. I can't remember what he said his exact stats were last season, but this is a kid who's going to be able to do both things that a tight end needs to do really well. And I think that there's a chance that he could blow up his senior year at Lincoln Southeast.
This kid had received interest, and again, with so few catches, he is a 6'5", 230-pound tight end. So that's a big reason. But he had interest from South Dakota, North Dakota State, Iowa State, Wyoming, South Dakota State, Nebraska, and Arkansas. With those few, with the little number. So to land a kid like that at UNI, a place that has shown they can develop tight ends, that's really impressive. And you mentioned Camrad. That is a guy that I was going to mention that I'm excited about too. Dual threat, like you mentioned, flying way under the radar as a 2-star. And UNI has guys come in that are dual threat. Obviously, you look at Will McIlvain, who just transferred to Central Arkansas. You go back even to Breon Carnes from a few years ago, whose brother was Brandon Carnes and became one of the greatest sprinters in UNI history. Or Aaron Bailey, who was able to launch it from time to time and run the football as well. But then you look at this kid, Cameron, who did fly under the radar, kind of similar in the way of Will McIlvain, who decided to walk on at UNI, ultimately get a scholarship, and then transfer as Coach Farley favored Theo Day last season. But Cameron, he's got interest rather from Iowa, Iowa State, North Dakota State, South Dakota, and South Dakota State. So clearly he can sling it.
Yeah, this is a kid that I think is going to blow up his senior year. He already led the Lewis Central to the state championship. He already put up big stats his junior year, and I think if he wasn't hurt his sophomore year, I think he'd be much higher on a lot of teams' boards. And so it's really going to come down to the relationship that UNI was able to build with him in holding on to that commitment. And from what I've heard from all of these kids that I've talked to, all these recruits, is that UNI has really prioritized the relationship. And that goes all the way back to Coach Farley talking to the media in the spring, as he mentioned that he needs to build a relationship with these recruits. And by all accounts, from all these kids, UNI is doing a really good job of building those relationships with their recruits. Every single guy, the first thing I ask them is, what makes you confident that right now UNI is the place for you? I think we had 6-7 kids drop their commitment in the last 2 weeks before their senior seasons. And all of them immediately talked about the relationship they have with one specific coach in particular. It's not the same coach every time. It's a different one almost every single time, actually. But they're really prioritizing the relationships with these recruits. And so those are going to be vital in holding on to some of these guys like Blum, who has a chance to blow up his senior year, Cameron, who has a chance to blow up his senior year. So I think that's the biggest thing is the relationships.
And getting these commitments from these high level players before they, quote, blow up and really start to do well is important when you're a small school like UNI. There's that success there where you're like, okay, I this is a place I want to consider. But then at the end of the day, I'm being under recruited. I know they can develop me. I know I have this potential. Let's work. And that's been a constant theme. I mean, even for players that transferred away, we're just really hitting all the transfers today. Omar Brown, who came in from Minneapolis, ultimately transferred to Nebraska. He was very under recruited and was very clearly one of the best corners in the country right away. And so speaking of corners, defensive backs, one player that you mentioned, but when we started to sit down here was DeAndre Beasley Jr. from Lee's Summit. That's a pipeline right there for UNI football. You said that his relationship with DeJuan Mack was a big reason why he decided to commit. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
There are guys who don't play at the same high school together, but they play kind of 7-on-7 together. And so they've built this friendship. And DeAndre Beasley, he's a guy who actually converted from running back to defensive back during his high school career. And he said one of the first guys he looked to kind of mold his game after was DeJuan Mack. So he's been friends with this guy, just the class above him for a while now. He's been modeling his game after him. And he and DeJuan Mack and Coach, name's escaping me here, Brandon Keith. Coach Keith was his primary recruiter. They built a really good relationship, that trio of them. And what DeAndre Beasley, in addition to that relationship, mentioned was the fact that he's going to go against the best of the best in the FCS and the Missouri Valley Football Conference. He said that's exactly what he wanted. He didn't want to run away from them. He wanted to match up and prove that he is better than you by going up against the best. And then also that relationship, he said that he and DeJuan Mack are going to come here, build something amazing. And that's really what Coach Keith kind of pitched him on, was building a exceptional secondary that's capable of winning championships at this level.
We're talking with Ethan Petrik from the Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier right now here on Cornstalk Sports Talk on AM 950, KOEL and KOEL.com. One other higher profile guy that actually had a ton of offers in this 2023 class was Lance Behrens. He's a 3-star, and that's clearly a huge get for Coach Farley. He had offers from Air Force, Army, South Dakota State, South Dakota, Western Illinois, Eastern Michigan, Idaho, and interest from Iowa, Iowa State, Kansas State, North Dakota State, and others. Not every day that 3-stars commit a season early to a school like UNI. Have you been able to talk with him yet? Have you been able to watch much of him?
I've not been able to get a hold of he or Jackson Storts. Jackson Storts actually, he has water damage on his phone, so he hasn't been able to contact like anybody. But those two haven't had a chance to get back. But the biggest thing with Lance Behrens is that's keeping the talent in state. I think that is one thing that a lot of people like to prioritize at any school in the country is keeping the talent in state. And so that's been a theme a little bit you've seen in these recent run of commitments as well from UNI is keeping these kids within the state to keep the talent here at UNI and make sure that no one escapes and goes to the Dakota schools and has a good career or goes to any of the other FCS schools. And I know it's not exactly in the state of Iowa, but Tyson Corman out of Randolph, Minnesota, that's right up the road. So keeping those guys that are within the radius, that's a term that when I was at Nebraska, they like to use, was keeping kids within the 500-mile radius. And I think UNI is doing an exceptional job of that right now, is kind of branching out in that recruiting radius, even in Hartford, Wisconsin with Storts, is keeping those talented players in that they can get.
One thing that I'll say about Behrens, and I haven't gotten in contact with him either, from Hartley Melvin Sanborn, so probably a very small school. He's 6'5", 240, according to 24/7 Sports. That's one of those kids that pops off the film. Like you're watching him play against some of these smaller kids, and it's like that dude is a D1 football player. And I'm sure Coach Farley thought the same thing. And to get guys like that early, like I mentioned, like Braylon and like Blum, that's just huge because you have that year of development. You have that year of, okay, this is what you want you to work on and eat and gain weight and get ready. It just couldn't be more huge. And it reminds me of a 2022 commit in Josiah Galvin, who had a ton of offers too. Big, lanky guy. It's not that UNI hasn't been impressive in their previous classes. I mean, they brought in a bunch of guys, but this is just an over and over again thing that's happening right now where they're getting this talent from these smaller schools and bringing them in. And even though they might have these offers from these bigger programs.
Yeah, I think that's probably the thing that can get you most excited is when you see a guy like a Jackson Storts who might not have an offer from Wisconsin, but he has interest from Wisconsin. They're talking to him, and that's the home state team for that guy. It's a team known for producing offensive linemen, and you're still able to wrestle them away. So I've been really impressed in my first year covering UNI and just their ability to recruit kids who have interest from perceived bigger schools, and that's a question that I've asked every kid is you're getting interest from all these other schools. I can't remember which one it was, but he had interest from a MAC school. Maybe I shouldn't say his name, but he had interest from a MAC school. And I said, well, why UNI if you're having interest from 2 to 3 schools in a group of 5 FBS program? He said, well, not only is UNI coaches making me more confident in their ability to develop me, but the facilities are nicer. So it might be FCS at UNI, but they're everything about the school other than that irrelevant variable is better. And so these kids are coming to UNI because of it.
And you can't say the competition is lower, especially in football, considering they're in the MVFC.
No. And what's the statistic that the Minnesota Gophers are 3-3 against the Dakota schools in the last 10 years or so. So that's one thing I encountered when I was working in Nebraska is there's this perceived idea about the FCS that it's a lesser program, but coming from Montana, I grew up watching the Grizz and the Bobcats and North Dakota State at that as well. I know the FCS is a high level and these kids understand it as well.
One thing that we have interacted on and talked a little bit about via Twitter is the fact that Coach Drew Tate, of course, a quarterback at the University of Iowa, now with UNI, has opened up some more recruiting trails. We mentioned Lee Summit, we mentioned the state of Iowa and Minnesota. Those 3 places are kind of typically the places that we see kids go to UNI from. Of course, you'll get the occasional Illinois or Nebraska or Wisconsin kid, but Drew Tate really opening up those recruiting trails there. I looked at the roster. I mean, there's currently 1 player on the UNI roster that came directly from Texas, and that's Edwin Dearman. If you're unfamiliar with the name, he's a backup to Corby Sander and Benny Sapp III in the secondary. You're going to know his name once Benny Sapp leaves for the NFL and Corby moves on wherever he ends up. The other ones are all transfers. Dom Williams, Quan Hampton, that transferred from Kansas, and then Jonathan Fenix from NAU, who's a new transfer this year. I mean, Texas is a mecca of high school football. How important is that to open up that pipeline from Texas too?
Well, there's going to be, with how high level of football there is in Texas, you're going to see some kids that just fall by the wayside because they have a 5-star sitting above them on the roster. So there are talented kids who are probably going to be like Omar Browns, who are potential high level contributors at the Division I level, who just don't get recruited because they don't get seen. So I think the biggest thing for UNI is to go in and find those hidden gems in Texas. If they want to branch out to Florida, which is also a high level football factory for Division I, that's going to be super, super big for them in getting talented players in-house and continue that almost the NFL pipeline that they're developing a little bit. So I really inspired to see that they're going in and they're trying to find these guys who you look them up and they're getting recruited by West Texas and these smaller schools in Texas. Because, I mean, I don't want to be biased because I cover them, but UNI is a higher level program and they're in the top FCS conference. So,
yeah, what more could you? It's like not only that, but Cedar Falls is a great town too, man. And to be at a big campus, but also be recognized as a person like UNI football does. You're not going to get that relationship importance at every school and from every recruiter. Anyway, he is Ethan Petrik from the Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier, joining us today to talk a little bit about the 2023 UNI football recruiting class at Ethan_Petrik on Twitter. Go give him a follow. He does a great job covering UNI sports and Cedar Valley High School sports as well. Ethan, thanks so much for the debut today, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Elliot. I appreciate it.
Now, don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be right back with that third and final segment. Sean Bock from 24/7 Sports and HawkeyeInsider.com. He's joining us today to tell us about Kadyn Proctor's decision to become a Hawkeye officially. Don't go anywhere. We got more Cornstalks and Sports Talk coming up in just a few right here on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com. We're back here on Cornstalks and Sports Talk on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com. Massive news last week as Kadyn Proctor from Southeast Polk, 5-star recruit and the top offensive tackle in the country, decided to commit to the University of Iowa. And now on to tell us about his decision is Sean Bock, who covers Hawkeye football recruiting for Hawkeye Insider and 247sports.com. Sean, what were the big factors? What went into this decision for Proctor deciding to stay in his home state?
Yeah, there was a lot that went into it, I think. And I think a lot of people at the beginning of the recruitment, and myself included, thought like, okay, this one's going to be tough. This one's going to be hard for Iowa. Kadyn Proctor obviously was grabbing a ton of offers after his freshman season at Southeast Polk, where, he had limited varsity action. And once his sophomore season rolled around, he was getting almost every offer in the book, and that just continued to go and go and go. And looking back at this recruitment a year ago, I would have told you that Iowa would be a big player for him, but I don't think I would have anticipated them being at the top of the recruitment as long as they had been. And I think you have to give a big hat to the coaching staff, the Iowa coaching staff, for this one, because they stayed consistent with Proctor. They sold him a message of, hey, you can come to Iowa City and be a really, important piece to what we're doing. And I think too, with obviously Iowa's offensive line track record and staying in state and the connections that he had on the team, the relationships he built with the coaches, having Xavier Wampa, another former Southeast Polk 5-star on the Iowa roster, was a really big factor too as well. But I think overall, Kadyn just kind of seemed like he had the right fit at Iowa. And he's a certain type of kid that I thought really did a good job of, during the recruiting process, looking into each school carefully and seeing what kind of fit he could be. He's a 16-year-old, 17-year-old kid, just got his driver's license recently. He's one of those personalities where, yes, I would say he's like pretty outgoing, but he's not the one where it's going to be like, okay, like, I want this to be a popularity contest with my recruitment. I'm not, I'm going to see which school shows the most love, which school thinks I can play right away, or which school is going to offer the most NIL money. And that wasn't the case. It was one of those things where, okay, where do I feel like I can be the best fit? Where do I feel comfortable? Where do I think that I can, have an impact, but also develop really well and, learn? And I think with Iowa, all those boxes were checked. All those boxes were marked with him. He felt at the end of the day that this was the right fit, just from a comfort standpoint and style standpoint. I mean, it doesn't get much better when it comes to Iowa with the NFL success and producing guys at that level. And I think Kadyn felt that he could be in that development area. And I think another big thing that I didn't mention earlier was I talked about playing early, and obviously that's important for him, but it's not the end all be all. He really looked at the Iowa offensive linemen from last year, some of the younger guys. And you look at Mason Richmond, Connor Colby. Connor Colby was a true freshman last year, started at guard for Iowa. Mason Richmond was in his second year with the Hawkeyes as a redshirt freshman. There were a couple other guys that were really emerging in the ranks that, Kadyn looked at and said, okay, like Iowa's going to be open to playing these guys if, they're capable of doing so. And Proctor, he has the starter kit of an NFL offensive lineman. He's compared to Trent Williams for a reason. I'm not saying he's going to be Trent Williams, but he's compared to him for a reason because he has all those tools that you want in a future offensive tackle in the NFL. And, if he can put the pieces together pretty quickly in Iowa City, then there's no doubt in my mind that he could potentially be a NFL draft pick after 3 years with the Hawkeyes. So, I think it just came down to fit at the end of the day and comfort with coaching staff. And obviously, I think the players on the team were really good with bringing him in and making him feel comfortable. And, all those things kind of just were perfectly aligned together. That's what, and at the end of the day, made his decision what it was.
It was a huge decision. Like I said at the top of this segment, I mean, I know people were waiting on it. And when he tweeted out that he was going to make his commitment at 1 p.m., that thing, it was like, oh boy, sure that was going to explode. You mentioned Xavier Nwankpa, who is another 5-star, his high school teammate. He's been out on the recruiting trail more or less via Twitter when folks say they're interested in playing for the Hawkeyes. How much of a factor was he in Proctor's recruitment?
Yeah, I think he definitely helped. I know when he committed to Iowa, he said like, okay, like wherever I'm going, I'm bringing Kadyn Proctor with me. And I'm not saying that was like final at that point, but there was definitely a lot of Iowa buzz with Proctor going back to the fall. I think when Wampa really started to, see the Hawkeyes rise up for him during his recruitment. So I don't want to say it was a huge factor, but I think it's always nice having some of those guys that you spend a lot of time around, you grew up with, like, Wampa and Proctor are really close. Gavin Williams, Iowa's running backs, really close with them. There are a number of other guys on the team as well that they're pretty close with. So I think it played a role. And I think that the kind of, I guess, narrative that Iowa gets is being that program that has 2-3 stars that develop into top-notch guys. But I think they also realize that, okay, we're elite tier prospects. I'm not saying stars matter; they're not everything. But I think Xavier and Kadyn realize, like, okay, yeah, like we're top of the class, like we're top, some of the top players in the country. But we have this program in state where our family can watch us play. We can be around people that we grew up with. We can put on for our home state, and we can also be developed in this program like Iowa. I mean, obviously you have Alabama, Ohio State, number of other programs, Notre Dame, that we're heavily after them that have great track records with NFL. But Iowa, I mean, for what Iowa does in the type of players that they get, they produce NFL players at a really high rate. And they're not always the most talented coming out of high school. With these guys, with the right coaches, with the right staff, the right development, I think Kadyn and Xavier really felt that, okay, at the end of the day, we're going to go to a place where it's not far from home and has a really good track record of producing guys to go places where we want to be. And I think Iowa really sold them on that. And that was a really important part with both of them. But I also think having Wampa there and kind of in Proctor's ear a little bit was important as well.
We're talking with Sean Bock from 24/7 Sports and Hawkeye Insider here on Cornstalks and Sports Talk on AM 950, KOEL, and KOEL.com, talking some Hawkeye football recruiting, more specifically 5-star recruit and top offensive tackle in the country, Kadyn Proctor. Now, you mentioned that true freshman last year started, some second-year guys. it's a year away. We don't know anything for sure, whether injuries are going to happen. Would you guess, considering how highly recruited and how highly touted of a recruit Proctor was, that he will start as a freshman? Is that your expectation right now?
I don't want to say that. I think it could be a David Davidkoff route, who is currently working with the 1s and 2s for Iowa, I believe, at the right tackle position. I'm not sure which spot Kadyn could play. I think that right tackle spot is pretty wide open for the next couple of years. I mean, Jack Plum's listed as a starter now. There's a lot of excitement about his improvement, but this could likely be his last year with the Iowa unless he decides to go the COVID route too. I think there's a chance. I mean, at left tackle, you have Mason Richmond. I think Richmond is a year or two away from being an NFL draft pick. And that left tackle spot behind him is pretty open. So I think the opportunity is there. It's just a matter of who else emerges. And, you want to look at the NFL stuff too. I think, behind Richmond, there's still some question marks with that position. But I think it depends what spot you want him at. But I think there's a chance. I mean, it'll help that he'll enroll early. I don't want to say he's going to be a starter right away, but I think he'll be right in that mix for sure.
And then one player that we haven't been able to talk about in the time that we've talked last, Trevor Lauck, committed. He's from Indianapolis, 4-star recruit. He's on the offensive line as well. What went into that? Did your expectations for Proctor's commitment change at all when Lauck committed? And how about what do you think of? Or excuse me, how about Lauck in his decision to commit to Iowa?
Yeah, no, with Trevor Lauck, that was kind of one of those things that seemed to be a long time coming as well. I went to his high school back in March, and that's when I really felt Iowa was emerging for him. Obviously, you look at those offers that he had at one point. Ohio State, Michigan was in there. Cincinnati was in there. Indiana, believe it or not, was one of his top schools, if not his top school at one point. They were in there. Purdue was in there. Michigan State, but Michigan State and Iowa were the ones that ended up being the top two. And I think one of the messages that really stood out with Lauck was George Barnett told him and Leighton Jones, who is also from Indiana, Iowa's another offensive lineman for the Hawkeyes. He's listed as a center. One of the messages that they really had sold Lauck was they were telling him, like, hey, you are exactly what we want in an offensive lineman. And I think when you look at that and when you hear that, you think about some of the past offensive linemen in Iowa and what they produce. And that's something that really speaks to a prospect, especially a guy like Lauck, who is, grew up in Big Ten country, has really paid close attention to Iowa's offensive line tradition as long as he's watched football. And that really sold him, I think. And plus George Barnett, I think this was one of Iowa offensive line coach George Barnett's best, wins or recruitments during his time at Iowa, during his short time at Iowa. Obviously, Kadyn Proctor was a big help, but that was for mainly Jay Neiman. And I think Barnett did a really good job there too. But I think with Lauck, that was a really important win for him as well, to go into Indiana, take him from a program like Michigan State, who has a lot to sell with the type of momentum that they have on the trail. But I think Lauck is one of those wins where, it was obviously Barnett, but I think too, having Leighton Jones on staff there as well was really important. And Leighton Jones, Trevor Lauck kind of just looks like a mauler, honestly. He can be either a tackle or a guard. I think he's listed at around 6'3", 6'4", looks the part at either offensive line spot. And could honestly play all over if he really wanted to, but I think he could be a mix and match in that tackle guard spot. But he has all the intangibles, like George Barnett said, that you want in an Iowa offensive lineman. And, I think having him on staff was really important in that win as well.
With Lauck and Proctor coming in, and not only that, but Kendrick Rayfield, it's just going to be able to hand the ball to Rayfield, and they're going to pave the way, I'm sure, in coming years. So that'll be fun to watch. Last question before we let you go, Sean. Some news came out this week about the Iowa City NIL Club. I don't even really know what to think other than it's another thing that's going to take away players from schools like UNI, because I'm selfish. What are your thoughts on Iowa City, the Iowa City NIL Club?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that, I was, believe it or not, I was actually in the city. I was in Chicago yesterday, so I didn't get to read fully up on it, but from my limited look or limited viewing of it. I think it's a good move for what Iowa wants to do. I know some people are a little weary about it. Some people want boosters coming in and making these huge deals with recruits and, getting all this surefire, like, this guy's getting a car, this guy's getting a certain amount of money. But I think it's pretty cool from a team perspective, from a fan perspective too, to offer this kind of viewing and, more like this package type thing that not only doesn't really benefit the recruits, but more so the team, and being like, okay, because a lot of people talk about NIL with recruiting, but I think with, getting the team stuff too, I think that's a really important part of it. And I know a lot of people were worried about Iowa, how they didn't take its time in doing stuff, or how it took its time in doing stuff. And, there were other programs where it really, took off and, making a huge impact on the recruiting trail. But I think at the end of the day, Iowa wanted to do something that made a lot of sense for the program and made the team feel comfortable in doing it. I know there's really not many selfish attitudes in the locker room that are worried too much about NIL and who's making more money or what, but I think at the end, I think it makes a lot of sense with what they want to do with this stuff. And I think it's cool for them to engage with the fans as well. I think that's a really cool aspect of it. And not just, okay, like this guy's going to make money, this guy's going to do commercials, this guy's going to do this autograph thing, or, I just think it's a really cool way for the fans to get involved and for them to be, feel like they're really part of the program. Because I feel like that's one of the things that this team could benefit from the most, and the fan base as well. I think it's really cool. I'm interested to see what happens with it and how successful it can be. It's more of like a subscription based, like membership based type deal. So it'll be a little different, but I'm really interested to see how this thing can take off.
I was just going to say it's another awesome opportunity for people in the fan base and for these athletes to make relationships with people in Iowa City, across the state, and Hawkeye fans everywhere. So he is Sean Bock from 24/7 Sports and HawkeyeInsider.com here on Corn Stalks and Sports Talk today to tell us about Kadyn Proctor's commitment, as well as Trevor Lauck, and talk a little bit about the Iowa City NIL club. Go give him a follow. It's SBock241, or oh my gosh, SBock247 on Twitter. Anyway, Sean Bock joining us today. Appreciate you hopping on, Sean.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Elliot.
And that's going to do it for this week's episode of Corn Stalks and Sports Talk here on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com. If you missed any part of today's show, you can always listen to us the whole episode on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're listening on any of those platforms, anywhere you can leave a rate and review, please do so. That does really help us out, gets us a little bit more exposure so we can get more guests, get better content for you. So we would greatly, greatly appreciate it. Of course, you can always listen to us. Our guest segments are on YouTube too, so just search Elliot Clough there and subscribe. We got great content up there for you, and you can always follow me on Twitter. Of course, I am a UNI insider for Town Square Media. It's at Elliot Clough on Twitter. So folks, thanks again so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Corn Stalks and Sports Talk.